So maybe a little meta narration would be good. So I have Athena up on my computer.
All right.
I printed up the question by student report just so we can look if there's any doubt about like which kids missed or got which questions correct. We have a couple copies of the test. I have your DDP, which I printed out and made my own notes on. And then there's just paper everywhere, basically.
Yeah. Oh, that's how we roll.
That's right. That's right. At the end, we're going to throw it all away. So I also have the question by our performance by test item report, just so we can go back to like how well do we do relatively on each question, relative to other schools and other questions for us. And then I also emailed you an Ames calendar earlier today, so if you just open that up. It's more a template than anything else, but since we'll be putting stuff into it, it'd be helpful to just have it up at the beginning. All right. So John, just to frame this discussion, because we could talk about algebra, talk about 8th grade math, talk about life. We're going to talk about 8th grade math specifically, and because of like our split between Georgia Tech and UConn, I want to focus primarily on Georgia Tech, because they're the ones who need the most help. Right? So the interventions we put in place are going to be primarily to help them. Instructional response is primarily going to help them, though you'll see like it will actually help some of the kids in UConn as well. So when you look at the data for 8th grade, like what are the 2 or 3 big takeaways where you look at the data and you're like, this is what's going on? Like aside from going into question by question analysis, what stands out to you?
I think probably the first big rock is like students' ability to approach like just word problems in general, and like then more complex contextual problems. There's a big divide in the percent correct for multiple choice versus the percent correct, and like looking through a lot of student work, a lot of kids' work had like almost, they would like use numbers, but in no way that made sense with like the problem. So like being able to parse out relevant information, choose correct operations even, and really like those problem solving strategies need to be like spiraled in like every single day for sure.
Yep, I think that you pulled away those 2 big rocks. I'd add one to those 2 that I also thought were a pretty big deal. So one of them is just a general like inattention to detail.
Yeah, and fluency and just like being able to like compute accurately and quickly like are totally lacking, and problems where students like set up the problem correctly and then made a multiplication error and addition error, and like you said, the attention to detail is not something I am holding kids accountable, so they are able to get away with not doing it.
You say you're not holding them accountable. Would you say that's still true today, or was that just true like last week? Do you feel you're holding them accountable to those things now more than you were last week?
Like I mean, after looking over the data and like being like, oh, that is why kids are like failing. It's not because they don't really understand the concept, it's because they're not getting the practice. Yeah, my instruction has sort of changed to make sure kids are doing that.
And so like, I think that's definitely a good change that you've already made. So I don't want to linger there on like the importance of doing something you're already doing. Right? Like you're already doing it because you think it's important. But I do want to make sure that that system is firmed up. So I want to spend some time there, and then we can get into some of the word problems. But that'll probably come up in this part of the conversation, and then we'll just do look a little bit closer at some of the other data. I love like smaller points. But I do agree, like attacking the word problems and problems in context and like attention to detail is going to be where we're going to get the most bang for our buck. So if you look at the Ames calendar that I sent you from Wooly, if you scroll to the right just a little bit, what you see here is like homework problem number 1, homework problem number 2, homework problem number 3 for each of these days.
Okay.
And so what he and I did is something I think would be valuable for you and I to do, at least in a skeletal fashion, which is to determine like what are the skills that we want to make sure kids are getting at bats with every night.
Okay.
Right. So you'll see that the 7th grade skills, there's a huge gap in order of operations. So there are like 3 order of operations problems for every night, something like that. So what are what jumps out from this data as the skills that you definitely want to give kids 1 to 2 to 3 at-bats with every single night?
I would definitely say multi-digit multiplication, just because that is the computation that I'm seeing the most, and also multi-digit division.
So are you talking with decimals, without decimals?
Right now, it would be, for Georgia Tech, it would be without decimals. Like their fluency and their ability to multiply, even with strategic intervention for certain kids, they still make really simple mistakes. And at least for the first week or 2 weeks, I'd want them to practice those skills without decimals, and then putting the decimals in after maybe week 1.5.
Yeah, so why don't you go ahead and script that out here. So questions 1 through, what do you think? You only get 20 questions, so be strategic. Should not be 1 through 19. But for the first, let's say for the first week, just 3 by 2-digit multiplication. How many problems do you think would be appropriate?
Probably 3 a day.
Let's start there, and we can add or subtract as we go. So those first 3 questions for the first, how many days do you think? Before you expand it to include decimals and the like.
Sorry, I didn't.
So how many days do you want this to go on for?
I'd say the first week.
Okay.
Which is a short week, so actually.
Great. So you've basically made your first 3 problems, or the skeleton for the first 3 problems for the first week. And we may mess with this as we find there are other things we want them to practice. You mentioned another thing I just want to put on the table right now, their ability to approach word problems and numbers in context. Do you want to take any of those problems to do this in context?
Yeah, I was thinking that, as I'm thinking about this, I think part of where I was seeing the struggle and the disconnect from exit ticket results to performance on the A, especially with Georgia Tech, is I think these first 2 would just be straight up computation, and then these 2 would be word problems with extraneous information.
Great.
So they have to eliminate one thing, but still it's multiplication.
Great. So to avoid having to recreate that in a couple weeks, go ahead and just write that in back to the plan now. All right. So I like that we're already working on fluency and building those habits, while at the same time embedding these into something that we're seeing as an overall problem.